Welcome, everybody. I think it is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And as always, I want to thank you for giving up your lunch hour to be with us. And as always, I want to thank the CoLab staff, video production, marketing, and I always want to thank Maureen as well for helping us put this series on. My name is Michael Carragher. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and I help sponsor the Great Book Series. And this is our second presentation this fall. We have one more to close out this semester, and that'll be in November with Eve Blobom speaking on Lolita. So that should certainly be interesting.
We'll try.
Yes, we will have 3 presentations in the spring, and we'll, as always, make you aware of those as they start to come on. I'm excited today to present Maureen Fitzpatrick. She's professor of English here at Johnson County. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in English from Iowa State University. She earned a master's in English from the University of Missouri at Columbia, and she has completed advanced coursework at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Maureen is in her 28th year here on faculty, and she teaches a variety of composition courses, and she also teaches our writing for interactive media, which is one of our very involved courses. And as I noted at the start, she's usually on the other side of the divide of the Great Book Series. She has long been coordinator of this and organizer, which again makes me very excited to hear her presentation today. She's active in our department's Common Read program. She runs the campus book talk, which is one of the discussion groups on campus. She serves on way too many committees to name. And recently she completed a sabbatical researching electronic literature and storytelling in new media. Simply put, Maureen is an avid reader. In fact, I don't think I've ever known a time where she's not working on multiple books, or when somebody mentions a title, she says, "Oh yeah, I've read that." And she crosses all genres too. She reads. She also enjoys what she calls simple arts and crafts, and she defines that by simple, specifically with knitting and crocheting, only things in rectangles. Anything else apparently requires a focus that she just is unwilling to give. And she spends a good deal of her time communicating with a very large, very chatty extended family. For our presentation today, Professor Fitzpatrick is going to talk about Jean le Carré's 1963 novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Of the book, she says this: Le Carré's The Spy Who Came In From the Cold not only reflects changes in the genre of spy fiction and in how the public saw the morality employed in the Cold War, but it is a masterclass in writing. I suspect we'll hear a little bit about the Cold War today, and I really suspect we'll hear a little bit about that masterclass in writing. At the end of her remarks, we'll try to take some questions, though we are going to be trying to keep it on a tight time frame of 45 minutes. Some of us have 1 o'clock responsibilities. Friends, my pleasure to present Maureen Fitzpatrick.
Hi. Just to let you know, this is it's allergy season, and my voice is going to hurt you more than it hurts me, I promise. Okay. I am going to go ahead and start PowerPoint, and let's go from the beginning. Here we go. So The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and I'm going to go a little bit off script. I came to John le Carré. I was in a fiction writing workshop, and the instructor for an assignment had us all pick a book that had been on the bestseller list sometime in the last 10 years. And I picked a book called Smiley's People, which I loved it. And then the professor asked me if I had read the first 2 books, because that's actually the last book in a trilogy. And I read the next two, or the first two actually. I loved the last book even more. And then I came to The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. That assignment, by the way, best assignment ever. Okay. But the first time you read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, you should just let yourself slip into le Carre's world of Cold War spycraft. Do your best to follow what is going on and who our hero, Alex Leamas, should and should not trust. But then you should make time to read it a second time fairly quickly before the subtleties of the plot wear fade too much. It's only 220 pages. And the second time, you should pay attention to all the clues that you didn't recognize the first time you read it, or the times that someone actually announces exactly what's happening and was dismissed, or the number of times George Smiley appears unnamed in Shadows and Myths. And if you're a student of fiction's techniques or an author of any stripe, then you'll want to read The Spy Who Came In From the Cold a third or a fourth time, just to study how le Carre plays hide and seek with his readers by manipulating perspective. Okay. Now, it did occur to me as I started researching for this presentation that instead of talking about the book at all, I might be better just to read you the first chapter. This is the book that Graham Greene, who knew something about spy fiction, considered the greatest spy novel he'd ever read. And Malcolm Gladwell, who doesn't write spy fiction, but who does like to twist and turn his readers around quite a bit, considers to be the most perfect first chapter. But I quickly realized I had a problem. The first chapter is set at the Berlin Wall in 1962. And for those of you under probably about 55, when I say Berlin Wall, if you have any image at all, you most likely think of this. Okay. November 9th, 1989, the day the wall came down after 28 years. And in order to understand the book, when you hear Berlin Wall, you need to think of this. This is the world was black and white in 1962. But this is the wall in le Carre's novel. Okay, so crash course on the Berlin Wall, and my apologies if there are any history professors out there. Okay. In the aftermath of World War II, Germany was split into 4 occupation zones. The areas occupied by Great Britain, the United States, and blue in this map are blue in this map, sorry. The Soviet section is in red. That orange dot deep in the Soviet sector is Berlin. Berlin, like Vienna and Austria, were split into occupation zones. However, while the occupation of Austria lasted only until 1955, the occupation of Germany eventually became entrenched into 2 different countries, but Berlin remained split. In the early 1960s, Berlin was a city of roughly 3 1/3 million people, of which 2 million people lived in the sections occupied by the West. It's important to know that the wall was not about trying to isolate or starve out the West out of Berlin. That had been done before. The Soviets, of course, had attempted that with the 1947 Berlin blockade, during which they cut off ground access to Berlin for over a year. However, the blockade ended as an embarrassment for the Soviets, as the Western nations supplied the trapped Berliners by airlifting anywhere up to 12,000 pounds of food and supplies a day. The wall was actually built 14 years later, and its purpose was to keep people inside the Soviet Union, that is. By early 1961, up to 1,000 people a day were defecting to the West via Berlin. And these were not just dissidents or unhappy people, but included scientists and skilled tradesmen like masons and electricians, the very people the East needed most to rebuild their society. So on August 13th, 1961, just over 60 years ago, Berliners woke up to find the streets being torn up, barricades and rolls of barbed wire surrounding the western section. And that insert map shows where the crossing points are. The wall did go all the way around the city. Eventually it was 27 miles of wall. And on the Soviet side, there was a no-go area where they completely tore up everything. And some 55,000 landmines were actually planted in that area to try to discourage people from escaping. Over the 28 years that the Berlin Wall divided the city, 140 people were killed attempting to cross the wall, including mostly escapees, but some soldiers attempting to stop them, and I believe once or twice soldiers attempting to escape. The years between 1961 and 1963, when Le Carre would have been working on these books, 32 people were killed, which averages to over one a month. Okay. So meanwhile, some 300 miles away from Berlin in Bonn, David Cornwall was working on his third novel. Officially, he was the second secretary at the Bonn embassy, but Cornwall was also applied by the secret intelligence agency, MI6, where he tapped phones, spotted talent, hosted East Germans on tours of the UK, and filed lots and lots and lots of reports. Because of his position in the Secret Service, Cornwall was required to adopt a pen name and to submit each of his novels for approval prior to publication. For his literary alias, he was advised to pick something that was solid and Saxon. So he selected the name John, which is Saxon, and Le Carre, which is French for the square. The first two novels passed through the approval process as quickly as they initially passed out of the public's eye. But his third novel took longer to be approved. The slowness, however, had nothing to do with any unintentional release of classified information or any accidental revelation of state secrets. MI6 was hesitant to approve The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and its themes of betrayal out of concern that if very many people read it, the book might actually depress the service's recruitment efforts. And it turned out they were right. So back to chapter 1. Chapter 1 opens in a cramped house opposite the Berlin Wall. Alec Leamas, 50-ish, solidly built, graying, is on edge for two reasons. First, he's been trapped in a room with Americans all day long. They've been waiting for Carl Riemek, an agent, assumed to have been blown and on the run. Secondly, Riemek is just the last of a list of agents in Leamas's network to have been blown or discovered. Several others, most of them, in fact, have been killed or arrested, then tortured and killed at the hands of the East German Security Organization's head, Hans-Dieter Mundt. Only a few years before, Mundt had been a low-level operative working in the UK, where in fact that is the very first book that Le Carre wrote. Okay. But it is the speed at which the roll-up of the entire Berlin network, the speed that has happened, that has left Leamas stunned. How, one of the Americans asks, does Mundt know? After the long day stretches into evening, Riemek's car is finally spotted at the checkpoint, and Leamas agonizes as the vehicle goes through the document check, then the security check, and then the currency check before it is allowed to cross. And the spotter informs Leamas that the driver is not Carl, but a woman. Now, Leamas is even more perturbed. Carl has sent his lover, a married bottle blonde that Leamas does not trust. He sent her across before him. Elvira tells Leamas that two additional agents in the network have also been killed, and Carl went to pick up papers and will be over on a bicycle crossing at that point later that night. Frustrated by Carl's lack of judgment, Alex sends her on to his apartment to use as a safe house. Why, he fumes, would anyone whose life depended on secrecy get involved with anyone, let alone someone like Elvira? Leamas returns to the house opposite the wall. He asks the nearby German official what the rules are now about gunfire. Would they be allowed to provide cover should Remick need it? No, he's told. Both sides can shoot anyone they want so long as that's on their own side of the wall. But if the gunfire should go on the other side, World War III. After several more hours, they spot the bike. The rider goes through the document check, then moves to the security check. Just the currency check left, and then he's up on his bike and through. But suddenly, sirens blare, spotlight blazes down. An East German guard takes a knee in the middle of the bridge and lifts his rifle and yells at the rider to stop. Remick plows forward. There's a shot, maybe two. Carl jerks, but somehow keeps pedaling. Another shot, and he is down. And Lemus hopes, for Carl's sake, that he is dead. So that was the first chapter, okay? And it not only sets a tone and introduces us to Lemus, but it also sets up the two questions that will push Lemus through the rest of the novel. The plot is driven by the question articulated on the very first page. How does Munt know? Everything that comes is about Munt, okay? But Lemus's character development is also driven by the question as to why a man in danger risks an emotional attachment. And yes, I do know the way it's written on the slide looks like why do fools fall in love? Okay. Lemus is flown back to London feeling certain he's going to be fired. However, the director, a man known throughout all of le Carré's books as Control, instead lures him into doing one more job before he comes in from the cold. The job is a plot devised by Control to implicate Munt, and Lemus hopes causes death, because all Lemus really wants is vengeance and to kill Munt. Control's plot is seemingly simple. Well, for a le Carré novel. Lemus will go to seed and get himself fired. Over months, his finances will erode. He will seem to be drinking too much, and he will alienate himself from all the other members of the service. He will get himself sent to prison and become even more isolated until he is approached by the Soviets as a potential defector. These are the things Lemus has planned. Things, of course, do not stick strictly to Lemus's plan. From the start, we learned that George Smiley, a senior operative, who Lemus respects but considers kind of soft, finds Control's plans distasteful. And Lemus does not count on meeting Liz Gold, a young woman who works at a library where Alec is temporarily employed and who is a member of the Communist Party. And if you're worried I'm just going to tell you everything about the whole book, don't panic. That's just the first 50 pages. So, back in the real world of 1962, le Carré discovered as Alex Lemus in an airport as the writer / second secretary / secret agent waited to return to his post in Bonn. The man, as far as le Carré knew, was not a spy, but he clearly had been traveling for a job. The man was short, weary looking, and he approached the bar, pointed to a bottle of whiskey, then fished out a handful of coins from his pocket of half a dozen currencies from all over the world. He found the correct coins, downed the drink in one gulp, and trudged away. Le Carré had not heard him speak a single word, but the weariness of the world traveler captured his attention. And in time, he transformed the man from a salesman into a spy. Le Carré was born David Cornwall in 1931. His father was a con man, literally. When David was very young, his father, Ronnie, served a jail sentence for insurance fraud and later served multiple additional sentences in places as far-flung as Jakarta and Singapore. When Ronnie was released from prison around 1936, David's mother left, claiming decades later that she saw it as her only chance to escape Ronnie's chaos. So she left David and a slightly older brother to be raised by their father. Le Carré claimed that the best training to be a spy came from being raised in a dysfunctional family. There he learned to keep secrets, and he learned to read a room and all of those around him for clues as to what was going to happen next. When he was 16, Ronnie sent David to Paris on his own to act as the bagman in an attempt to collect some cash that the senior Cornwell felt that a gangster owed him. David returned without the cash, but he did in fact return, so that's not bad for your first encounter with a gangster. David had to drop out of both boarding schools and later Oxford at various times when his father lost his tuition fees in one scheme or another. In fact, Ronnie's cons never stopped. When le Carré traveled to New York for the very first time, shortly after the publication of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and after it had rocketed to the top of the bestseller list, he arrived at his American publishers only to learn that his father had conned them out of 100 copies of the book for promotional purposes. His father had been settling hotel bills with copies of the book, autographed with the inscription from the father of the author. And so for years afterwards, whenever le Carré would come across one of those books, he would add his own inscription from the son of the father of the author. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As a very young man, le Carré had been recruited to work for MI5 during his national service. So he's one of the very few authors turned or spies turned author who's worked for both MI5 and MI6. He was fluent in both French and German, as well as having a smattering of other languages. And in the time between MI5 and MI6, he taught both languages at Eton. When he got tired of Eton, he let himself be recruited to the intelligence services, which is how it happened in Britain in those days, where he calculated he worked for about 7 years doing what he considered mind-bogglingly boring work. In 1964, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was on the bestseller list for over a year, and le Carré left the service. There are reports that le Carré's identity had been blown by the double agent and Cambridge 5 members, Kim Philby, after Philby had defected in January of 1963, which is neither hard to believe, nor is it any indication that le Carré played any large role in MI6. Philby, of course, was held mostly in house arrest, being debriefed for 7 years by the Soviets. So by the time they were done, they knew the name of everybody's dog walker. Okay. However, le Carré wrote that he doubted he would have stayed at the agency much longer regardless. He wrote in his memoir, too, that he was too much like his father. He craved change. And he said, as a writer, he just planned his cons out in paper rather than spreading them over continents, ruining other people's lives. Of course, le Carré is not alone in the transition from spy to author. There have been a long list of spies turned literary. Roald Dahl, Ian Fleming, Graham Greene, to name a few in the generation before le Carré. However, le Carré's Spy Who Came In From the Cold is seen as transitional in spy and fiction thriller, the fiction thriller genre. Prior to the mid-20th century, opinions among critics and readers regarding genre fiction. Genres include things like fantasy, horror, mystery, science fiction, westerns, and spy thrillers were often dismissive. For example, Graham Greene categorized his own literary work into two classes. There were the novels on which he thought his legacy would rest, like The End of the Affair or The Power and the Glory. And there were what he called his entertainments, books that he considered to be too light to be of consequence, like his own spy novels, including Our Man in Havana and The Quiet American, which are now both recognized as classics. Only much later did he realize that he should be classifying all of his books as novels. But for most of the 20th century, spy novels were invariably a story of good versus evil. And in general, we were good and they were bad. Even if at times, as in Our Man in Havana, good might be a hapless British incompetent and evil might be the UK's own overbloated bureaucracy. But the point was that we were never bad. With The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, however, although the reader knows who they like in the book, it is more ambiguous what characters are on the side of good, or if there is even a side of good. Le Carre also held that in a well-constructed spy novel, nothing happens. And when he says that, he doesn't mean there is no plot and there is no movement, because as you can see from The Spy from the Cold, people are being killed, sent to prison, defecting, all these sorts of things. When he talks about nothing changes, he means nothing in the outside world, that no one should know what is going on in a well-executed spy novel, or in a well-executed spy plan, sorry. So the most common comparisons, and I always think of that when I think of James Bond, because at least in the movies, there is a path of destruction that follows this man wherever he goes. It is not that nobody knows what's going on. And the most common comparisons when you're talking about the impact of Le Carre on the spy genre are the contrasts between his work and the iconic Bond series begun by Ian Fleming, who sadly died just as The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was a bestseller. That series, of course, has been carried on by about 8 to 12 other authors. Okay. It is, of course, worth noting that between the time the Bond character debuted in 1953 and the arrival of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold in 1963, that the world had changed. There had been the uncovering of several moles inside intelligence agencies, which had taken the shine off the idea of agents as international protectors. The Berlin Wall had gone up, and the world kept feeling more and more dangerous and less like everything could be solved by just one or two good men. Still, the contrasts in the characters are notable. James Bond has a solid Saxon name. He is tall, slender, handsome, irresistible to women, talented but beatable at most physical activities, which gives him a sliver of vulnerability. He is Bugs Bunny clever and perpetually in his late 30s to early 40s. George Smiley plays what seems to be a secondary role in The Spy Who Came Into the Cold, but he is the key character in Le Carre's works overall. He has a ridiculous name. Who chooses Smiley as a name for a spy? And he is the opposite of Bond in just about every other way. Smiley is always described as short and pudgy. He is often compared in his looks to a frog. He is often cuckolded. He is sedate and sedentary, academic, and he is brought out of early retirement somewhere in his late 50s at least 4 times between the years of 1960 and 1982. Le Carre's whole fictional world, the circus, where Smiley and Lemus are technically stationed, is invisible while in plain sight. And the service, its actors, and its actions inhabit a morally ambiguous world, which makes the stories more complex. Okay. The ambiguity alone engages many readers of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. You can debate for hours after you read it. Who knows what? How much of the plan is actually planned? In fact, Le Carre decided that the question of George Smiley's role alone in the book was worthy of a whole other book. But for most readers, it is Le Carre's writing that also distinguishes his work from others in the genre. And for those of you who study fiction as a craft or who write in any field, I want to draw your attention to some particularly interesting techniques Le Carre deploys in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. Le Carre's decision to use an omniscient point of view stands out as atypical for both the time and the genre. Traditionally, writers in suspenseful fiction will select either a first-person narrator or a limited omniscient narrator. In other words, they stick around the protagonist and they don't give the readers access to almost anyone else's thoughts. The reason for this is to help control what the reader does and does not know. We only learn things when the protagonist learns things, and we know everything the protagonist knows, generally. And if our point of view character doesn't know something, we don't know it. In The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, however, le Carre slips in and out of a variety of characters' thoughts, but does so with such a light touch that it seems more empathic than omniscient. Apart from Lemus, we spend the most time with Liz in the chapters where she is separated from Alec. But if you're studying the book, I particularly recommend that you look at the third chapter to see how he uses point of view. This is the chapter where Lemus goes to seed. He covers months inside of paragraphs. And for these pages, le Carre keeps us out of Lemus's head. And we see Lemus through the eyes of his colleagues at the circus and the eyes of his neighbor. We hear rumors and we're not sure what is true and what is not. We know from chapter 2 there's a plot afoot for Alec to alienate himself. But how much of his behavior that we are seeing in chapter 3 is actually part of the plan? Is he actually drunk, or is he just drinking strategically? What is acting, and how much of it might be the stress of being truly in the cold, even while living among your own people? As interesting as whose minds we slip in and out of at key points in the story is the list of characters whose minds we never enter, largely because they are kept off stage from the reader, but also, we suspect, because they knew too much. We don't get into the thoughts of Munt or George Smiley, and that turns out to be important. Okay. On the current cover of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, there is a banner that declares the book to be a George Smiley novel. But I will leave it to others to decide if that is just a marketing ploy, like George Smiley, buy this one too, or if it is merited. Smiley does in fact appear in the novel, but just barely. His name is only mentioned 20 times in the entire book, and most of the time that is people talking about him, not to him. He has some other appearances that I only recognized as Smiley on my second and one on my third reading. His name, and yet the more you read the book, the larger his presence does seem to grow. In 2017, le Carre published the last book that George Smiley would appear in. The book, The Legacy of Spies, revisits the spy who came in the cold from the first person point of view, at least 30 to 40 years later, Peter Gwillim, the faithful right-hand man to George Smiley. In the 21st century new era of openness and accountability, the circus has reopened the Lemus Gold case and is looking for somebody to blame. I have to confess that before I read it, I was very concerned. This was, after all, just 2 years after Harper Lee had upended our entire view of Atticus Finch by releasing her previous novel. But I promise you, Legacy really does not change anything that happened in The Spy. It is not a revision of it. Rather, I believe that it was le Carre's chance to play more with characters that he didn't get to come back to in the rest of his career. He fills in the backstory for Lemus and even Gwillim, who appears in almost every one of the novels, rather than changing the original. And that makes it worth the read. That is after your 3 readings are of The Spy Who Came In From the Cold are done. So how does the book actually end? I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but I can tell you this much, which may ruin it. Okay. The book ends where it begins. It ends in Berlin with the senior operative watching the wall. It ends with the spy and his lover racing across Eastern Germany, running to escape. And it ends in betrayal. So if people have questions,
We do have
Maureen?
time for a few, so please jump in. Kathleen?
I have a question. This is
Okay.
Kathleen.
Hi, Kathleen.
What is the difference between MI5 and MI6?
MI5 is domestic and MI6 is international. So it is sort of the difference between the FBI and the CIA.
Okay. Thank
Does
you.
that help?
Yeah, that helps. I'm reading a novel right now that gets into this, and I was having a hard time figuring out what the difference was.
Um, there is a very old joke where somebody was talking about combining MI5 and MI6, and they're like, "What happened?" It'd be like MI11, and yes. What's the book?
It's part of the Thursday Murder Club series,
Okay,
and it's the second book, The Man Who Died Twice.
okay. So heads
So-
up, Lakari will help you with that one.
Yeah, I need to reread. I need to reread the trilogy.
Yeah. Other questions? If you've never read Lakara before, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is absolutely my favorite. But then I would skip to the trilogy, which is Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, The Honor Schoolboy less so, and then Smiley's People. And then you'll just read what you want.
Maureen, you started with a historical context of Berlin and the occupation. This side of the Cold War, this side of the wall falling, do you think the book reads differently now? And if so, can you speak to that to maybe a younger audience or students,
Yes,
the other side who don't have that context?
I think in a large part that is why he felt compelled to sort of revisit it. But I tell you, Brexit also weighed very heavily on Lakari's mind. And in fact, just days before he died, he got his father distraught. But yes,
Maureen, your
I mean,
audio's-
the world has changed.
your
Pardon?
audio cut out just a little bit there.
Oh, I gave away the ending. No, sorry. But I think I have not had the experience of being a person who does not remember the Cold War reading this book. And so I do think maybe a little background comes in, but honestly, I think so many of the themes ring true now. I think in some ways, the shock that readers in 1962 would have had getting to the end and sort of reading everything would be less so now because we are by and large just much more skeptical of our government as in 2021. But I do think that there's so much of the conflicts going on now that do have roots in the Cold War that it is important for people not to think that that is a closed chapter of history and we don't have to worry about it anymore. It's like, oh, happy ending, the end, bye. No.
We probably have time for one or two more questions if anybody has one.
I have another question.
Please.
I remember watching the movie that was made from The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and I thought it was amazing. How do you think the movie compares with the book's portrayal?
I remember, it's been a long time since I've seen the movie. I remember, I love Richard Burton, but I thought he was an odd cast for this particular film because I don't think you would ever not notice Richard Burton in a crowd. And I remember there being some added scenes. If I'm remembering right, he goes to a communist meeting with Liz. So I really don't feel qualified to address it because I just can't get over Richard Burton when I think it should be someone who is much more invisible.
Right, which may not be so good for a movie.
Probably not. And I'm sure in particular, he did not have much choice in the casting. He was thrilled because he just like Richard Burton as a person, but he had the same reservations about how he would contain just his Richard Burtonness. But he did like he said the oddest thing was they changed the name in the movie from Liz to Nan, I believe. And part of that is because this was during one of Richard Burton's marriages to Elizabeth Taylor. So
I didn't realize that.
yeah.
Thank you.
In the chat, we have a request for the list of your recommendations again.
Oh, sorry. Spy Who Came In from the Cold is obviously my favorite. And then I would go to the trilogy, which is Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, The Honorable Schoolboy, and Smiley's People. Honorable Schoolboy is weaker. Personally, I find his work that centers in Europe is a little stronger, but after making a mistake in his research during Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, he was relying on an old tour booklet and realized quickly that he didn't realize there was a tunnel where there hadn't been one before, which actually changed how somebody escaped. But he was a demon for research. He danced with not Anwar Sadat, Arafat. He was shot at in Cambodia. He went to great lengths to meet warlords in the Congo to research his books.
Maureen, we have a question from Andrea, and I think she'll probably be our last question.
Okay.
Hi, Maureen. I love listening to this analysis and plot. How much does the book help people get a sense of Berlin, West and East at that time period?
I would say the later half, once he goes over the wall, we have a little bit in Berlin, but we do have more that is in the Soviet section of East Germany. So Berlin is mostly featured, I would say, in the first and last chapter. Other than that, we have a lot of London, and then we have a lot of, he doesn't get out much after he first defects. So we don't get a lot of contact with like normal people.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Huh?
All right, Maureen, thank you so much for a great presentation. It's a book for some of us to take off the shelf again, and for others to maybe go find for the first time.
220 pages.
There you go. There's a good sell right there. All of you who've joined, thank you so much. You are what keeps the series going, and we appreciate the time you've given us. Again, please check back with us in November and 3 times in the spring, and we'll try to keep bringing you some great presentations. Maureen, thank you. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.